Hi, everybody. I am super excited about today. We are doing pandemic makeovers for Halloween STEM challenges. I've been hearing and seeing a lot of comments about teachers saying they miss STEM challenges and they're upset that they can't do them this year because either they are distance learning or having to adhere to some social distancing. And there are ways around it. So, we are going to talk all about that today so that you can still do your STEM challenges because there's room for joy in all of this mess, I promise. So, the way we're going to do this today, I put up a little agenda for myself just so I can make sure I stay on track and you know what to expect. So, we're going to start with an overview of some things that you can do for distance learning or social distancing that will apply to any STEM challenge. So, it'll be sort of like universal expectations or ideas. And then we will move into each of the 5 Halloween STEM challenges that you see listed there. And I'll give you some specifics. Okay. And I know that the main thing that we're worried about is, how do we manage the materials? There's basically 2 big problems, right? This year it's materials. And that's either because you can't share them or you need to provide for all of your students. So it's expensive, or your students are at home and you don't know what they have there and you don't want to stress parents out, and you don't want your parents to feel like they have to go out and buy anything. So I'm going to give you ideas to work around all of that. And then the other big issue is collaboration. How do we collaborate if the kids can't get within 6 feet of each other? So we're going to talk about that as well. So I wanted to point out before we get started that little ticker along the bottom is 3 different options for where to get more information about each of these challenges. So all of these have a video walkthrough of what it looks like in a normal year, blog posts, and all of that stuff. So let's start. Let me take this part off the screen and let's talk first about universal modifications that apply to any STEM challenge. Okay. And we're going to start with the materials issue because I think this is probably the thing that's stressing people out more than anything else. Okay. So, one more thing before I catch myself. I keep looking off to the side when you see me doing that. That's so I check my notes to make sure I'm staying honest. One thing I wanted to say is even if you can't do Halloween STEM challenges with your kids because, you don't observe holidays at your school, I'm going to give you ideas for that too, because each of these challenges works and doesn't necessarily need to be linked to Halloween. So before we get into that, let's talk about your general materials issues. So first of all, I think what really helps is to make the materials acquisition part of your actual STEM challenge. So my goal today is to give you ideas that are cheap or free, because whether you're the one getting the materials or the parents are, money is tight and we don't want to stress anybody out, right? So let's talk about that. I'm moving my little materials thing in here so I can see clearly and catch all my notes. So one thing you can do, whether your students are at home or they're coming to you in class, is to have them start either with a shoebox maybe or a grocery bag or a plastic bag, start collecting what I call clean trash. Now, the reason you want them to do this is it can apply to not only the challenges we're going to talk about today, but any challenge. And so one of the things I usually, direct them to look for is any food packaging once it's been used. So cereal boxes are great, lids for water bottles, toilet paper tubes. I know you know all those things, right? So anything that's basically clean, like a piece of foil that they, maybe used to cover something up and it didn't get nasty. Well, you don't need to throw that away. That could come in really handy later, right? So start training them to start collecting these things so you just have like a general stockpile. Another thing that I think is really a great place to start is you probably, if you were doing STEM challenges on a regular basis, have some sort of go-to materials or things that you use a lot. So for me, things like string, pipe cleaners, tape, those things come up over and over and over again. So one thing you can do, again, whether you're having to observe social distancing or you've got all your kids at home, is to maybe make a little list of maybe a few of these things and ask the students, make a lesson out of this about figuring out what are the physical properties of these, what is the function. So if we're talking about string, we know, it's very sort of flexible, right? But it doesn't hold its shape. So start having those conversations. Now, although I'm going to talk about collaboration in a minute, this is one of the things you could do if you're able to do either breakout groups in Zoom, and I know not all schools allow you to do that, or Google. That's one thing. You could have them actually assign out and talk in small groups about, what are these properties? What are the functions? And then trying to come up with 3 to 5 alternatives if you didn't have string, but you needed something that would perform like string. What are some things you could use that most people would have at home, right? And so you might come up with things like, oh, well, maybe, and you maybe even have them look around. This is maybe one of those things you do where you need a quick break and you say, hey, after we've defined all that, hey, go look around. You've got 2 minutes. Look around your house and see what you could use if you didn't have strings. So maybe your parents have like an old lanyard. Maybe you have a shoelace you could take out and use, as long as we're not going to like cut it or ruin it. Maybe you have ribbon from a gift. Maybe you have a plastic bag and you can cut it into strips and braid it. And I actually really like this because it's trash, right? But it's pretty strong and you can make quite a few of these braids. Now, there are probably some kids who don't know how to braid, so you can task somebody who does know how to braid to create maybe a how-to video, maybe a little Flipgrid demonstration, and you could start to compile a list of substitutions like for your main materials that you're going to use that would be like a shared document. And I would do that again for like string, for tape, pipe cleaners, craft sticks, and even measurement tools, right? So if you can't depend on your students having a ruler or a measuring tape at home, then we have to come up with some things that are customary that most people would have access to or would understand roughly what it would equate to. So you're going to see today when we're talking about the Halloween STEM challenges, I'll talk about things like the width of your pinky. Not everybody's width of their pinky is the same, but it's probably close enough that you can get like a general rule, right? Soda cans, you can either do that by height or by the diameter. You could talk about soup cans that same way. I've got some other ideas. Oh, a AA battery, a toilet paper roll, quarter, dime, or penny, just standard coin. The distance from elbow to wrist. Again, that's not going to be the same for everybody. We know that, but it gives a general idea. And in some challenges, students are really, when they're doing their iterations or their redesigns, they're measuring against themselves. So if they're using the same distance, that's on their body, that's going to be consistent throughout, right? So those are some ideas, but I would have the students generate those ideas. I would have, and if you can have them in groups talking or using Padlet or even just recording their answers on something like Flipgrid, it's a way that they can be thinking and processing, and you can come up with a big class list. And then most of your general materials will be done. Then throughout the year, and hopefully someday things go back to normal sometime soon, but as long as we're in this pandemic mode, then you only have to come up with alternatives for very specific items for specific challenges. And then those general ones are already done for you by the students. That makes sense? All right. And then I would ask along the way things like, is this a good substitution? So if you said, in this challenge, what the ideal material would be cotton balls. But let's say you didn't have cotton balls. What might you use to substitute it? And then have them come up with their examples. Maybe they think, things that they have around the house, like rocks or bouncy ball or, tissue wadded up, whatever it is. And then have them compare and contrast. Ask them, is this a good substitution? Why or why not? What are the strengths of this as a substitution? What are the weaknesses? Because a rock might be the same size as a cotton ball, but it's certainly heavier. And so depending on how we're going to use it, it might not be a good substitution. If all we need is the size, that could work well. But if we need something that's light or something that's soft and fluffy, that's not going to work, right? But we have the students generate this. And I think if we use that as an idea that this is a base lesson, and it's a great lesson because we're doing compare contrast, identifying physical properties, and then really even judging what are the most essential qualities that make this like this or not like this. And that's a great lesson to do over and over again. We're also teaching them to be resourceful. Now, you might know that usually I have behind me a STEM ideals poster, and it looks a little bit like this. I'm actually blocking part of what I want to show you. Let me undo that and undo the other one. Okay, there we go. One of the STEM ideals that I really like to have my students look at and think about is being resourceful, because I always want my students not to feel like, oh, I can't do something because I don't have this. I think this is a great life lesson and life skill anyway. And so this is an awesome opportunity for students to practice that. So being resourceful, this is not the only time this will come up, I am sure. Let me go ahead and bring this back up. I think I just missed the one I want to have on screen. There it is. Okay. And moving on, collaboration. I want to make sure I got everything on the materials so far. And materials we're gonna keep talking about that as we go through the Halloween specific examples. Okay. For collaboration, now we know our students are probably not going to be able to actually physically work together to build. I know some of you are in environments where that's okay. I'm assuming more restrictive environments. And if yours is less restrictive, then that's great. You have even more options. And like I said, in that scrolling ticker down there, the first one that says bit.ly Halloween STEM videos goes to the Halloween playlist that shows what these challenges look like in a normal year. And so you can sort of take your ideas from both places and figure that out. But for collaboration, your kids probably can't build together, but there are things they can do to plan together and give each other feedback. So using things like Padlet, shared Google Slides, Flipgrid to present and provide feedback, very helpful. Again, if you can use breakout rooms, that's great. If you're virtual, if you cannot use them, then what I would do is probably have students in like little, but 5 or 6 at a time, present their ideas or their designs, and then have other students in the class give them feedback. I'd probably only do 5 or 6 at a time because I think you start to burn out after you listen to more than that. So I just spread that out maybe over a few days or a week, depending on how much contact time you have with your kids. Or you can have them do things in Flipgrid and then respond back to assign them into groups of people they need to converse with. I'm going to give you more examples as we go through specific to each challenge, if that makes sense. And then one of the things you can do if you're there planning together is to have them give each other feedback, but also if you want them to be a team and to create a team design, what they can do is find an element, a design element or a material element that they all have in common that they can use as sort of their unifying theme, even if the designs themselves are different, but we all happen to use a plastic bag in a certain way. Then that can work that way. And then, okay, I'm ready. So I'm going to take off one of these little banners here. And before we dive in to our actual Halloween challenges, and we're going to start with Wings Wanted, I wanted to tell you 2 things. First thing is, yes, these challenges do have printable and paperless resources, but you know that you don't have to have them. It will make some things easier for you, but I know your money is tight. So 2 things I want to tell you is, I provide a lot of free resources like this one that will go through and talk through all these different ideas. Also, next week, very important, you are going to have an opportunity. One of these challenges, I'm going to give the print and paperless version away for free, but it's only going to be one day next week. And the way that you make sure that you don't miss that notification is either being on my email list. And if you get emails from me every week, you're already there. So just make sure you check on Sunday and Monday. I'm going to email you and tell you what you need to know. If you're like, sounds great, but I don't want to be on your email list, lady. Okay, then follow me on Facebook or Instagram and you'll see a post next week. Make sure you're paying attention Sunday and Monday. Okay. And before we dive in, I'm going to show you a 30-second video that is going to do like a basic overview of what the 5 challenges are. And it's only 30 seconds. So let me pull that in and I'll be right back. I thought it was going to do a whole black screen and it didn't. So that's good to know for the future, isn't it? Okay, so let's start with Wings Wanted. So this is I think the easiest one to start with because the materials are very, very simple. And it's just the simplest one. So if you're only going to do one STEM challenge, this for Halloween, this is the one I would do. Now, I mentioned that I would say if you can't do Halloween, this is really, it's bats and it's paper airplanes. So connect it to Stella Luna or connect it to any life science lessons you might have going on food chains, ecosystems, and that kind of thing, right? Easy peasy. So, as I said, it's basically a paper airplane challenge. Now, in the like old days, the way that I would do this, I think I actually have a little thing where I can show you the criteria and constraints list. So as we're going to talk about each of these challenges, I'm going to tell you materials ideas, and I'm going to tell you how you might need to change the criteria and constraints list, or how you would measure success based on the pandemic rules, right? And I'll also tell you anything that you might want to change. Oh yeah, and the way that you measure results. Okay. So basically, this is a paper airplane challenge. And in the normal situation, I give them a printout that has like a bat body, but it doesn't have any wings. And they have to create a paper airplane. And the criterion constraints, I always make them editable, and I always give ideas in those walkthrough videos and in the resources to make it more challenging if you need to for older students or students who have more experience with STEM challenges. But basically, wings must enable the bat to fly the longest possible distance when thrown. Usually my constraints are about materials and time. If your students are working from home, I don't think you need to give them a time constraint because you aren't going to be there to watch them anyway. Materials are going to be sort of naturally constrained by what they have available. Now, I'm probably not going to I wouldn't be sending home these little handouts that have bat bodies but no wings. But what you could do is, if students don't have scratch paper, they probably get plenty of junk mail, right? I know I do. I get all the stuff that's like asking you to vote right now. And some of that's really good because it's like really thick. Tell students to start saving that stuff. That's going to be like beautiful throughout the year, and it's free. And then also these little mailers, right? And I would have them collect all kinds of things and talk about the differences in rigidity and what that might make it good for, what that might make it not so good for. In fact, the students maybe make the same exact paper airplane out of both materials and see which one flies better. Even in your junk mail, like these extra little envelopes, tell them to start saving those too, because different things are going to be useful for different types of challenges that they're going to do. Also, ask them to see if their parents get these address labels sent to them. I don't know about you, but I get a ton of them. And I do use them, but I have got more than I can use. So that's a thing that they can use if they don't have tape on hand. I've been using them all day today as I've been preparing for some things I wanted to show you. It works beautifully. So that's really all they need. It's helpful if they have scissors, but they can get around not having scissors with this challenge. It will work. They can just use folds, or they can be very careful about the way they do tears. If they are finding themselves frustrated by certain things that they encounter as they're doing their designs, that's not a problem. That's a discussion point. That's something they can bring. And in fact, it's one of the questions I usually ask students. What, if any, frustrations did you have with this challenge? Have them share. You can do a Padlet on that if you're asynchronous or whatever. Or you can just ask a whole class and have them, raise their hand on screen or in person and tell you about that, and then work through it. But try to get the other students to be the ones who give ideas or demonstrations if possible. As much as you can, you always want to sort of pull back and not just not be the one who's giving all the ideas. That makes sense. I also don't like to show them examples before we start. Some of your kids are going to have experience making paper airplanes and some of them are not. I tend to not worry too much if they get frustrated, because I know I'm going to use that as a lesson point, because it's normal to get frustrated. And that's one of the things, if we can teach our kids, what do you do? How do you handle it when you get frustrated, to like move forward in a productive way? I don't worry too much about that. Now, you might not be at a point right now where like the idea of like having kids frustrated might just be like, that is the last straw. I can't take anymore. In which case you could show them, there are YouTube videos, ton of YouTube videos about making a paper airplane. So if you wanted to, and again, I don't typically do this, but sometimes you make exceptions based on, you read the room. If the room isn't handling frustration this week, then maybe you start by showing them an example of a paper airplane folding video. They don't need to follow that. They can make their own. But one of the things I usually try to encourage them to do is Okay, if you want to follow along for the first one and make it exactly like it, okay, fine. Like that, because that's learning, right? But then try to do a second one where you change something and see if it helped or it hurt. One of the things I would do on measurement on this, because they're probably going to be flying these either in their house. Oh, very important. Make sure you tell your students if they're doing this stuff at home, they need parent permission and parent supervision, because the last thing you want is for them to throw a paper airplane and somehow like knock something fragile down and have a parent upset with you. So make sure that you kind of walk through that with your kids, that you should make sure your parents are watching you. Preferably you want to go outside, but you need to have permission, blah, blah, blah. And then the way I would have them measure that, if they don't have measuring tape, and many of them won't, is to just walk heel to toe, because they're only going to be measuring against themselves anyway as they're trying to make improvements to their designs. So as long as they're walking in a straight line heel to toe, I would have them collecting that data and tracking it and graphing it later. I would also encourage them to try throwing it in different ways. Like, are you releasing when it's angled up? Are you releasing angled like straight ahead? I would ask them to design their or define or maybe sketch the flight path, because some of their planes may do loops. Some of them may do a nosedive. Some of them might do something in between. And one thing that could be really good to do is to ask your students when you're meeting up after they've done their first test, how many of you have an airplane that did a nosedive? And then have them hold it up on screen. If they're in class, they can hold them up and everybody can look around, or they can put them, bring them up and put them on this, on the ground, but stay, 6 feet apart, whatever they need to do. And then maybe do sort of a gallery walk with 6 feet apart where everybody can sort of look and see. Try to figure out, what do these designs have in common that might make them do a nosedive? Same thing you can ask with any other flight pattern. How many people had a plane that went at least 5 heel to toes? And then have them hold them up or whatever and keep going further and further. And then when you get to, the most successful ones, try to figure out, what do they have in common? Did it do a loop? Who had one that did a loop? What do they have in common? So if you wanted it to do a loop, what could you do? And then I also like to have students give themselves their own sort of award, like a best what? Is it the best, the best flyer, the most style, whatever. They can decide what it is. But I think those are really good and helpful tools to use. And again, this is a great one for collecting data and graphing and really paying attention to what differences does it make, the way that I release it, or I threw it really hard versus I was sort of like smooth and gentle and I did like a medium range. Have them change up their grip, where they release, and how hard they actually throw, the force that they put behind it, and see what difference it makes, if any. Have them keep a chart. Okay. So let me put this off and let me take this one back on for a second, just to remind you, if there's anything else you want to know about this challenge, any ideas for extensions and all of that, you can check out any of the links that are coming by on the bottom below. And now we're going to move into Bone Bridge. So I'm going to take my bat off. Wings Wanted is done. We're on to Bone Bridge. All right. So Bone Bridge. Now you can build the bridge typically in a typical year. I would usually build the bridge for length, strength, or maximum length, strength, or capacity. Length, strength, or capacity. And let me put up for a second, I'll put up the criterion constraints the way they usually look. So this is a criterion constraints list that's basic, and that's made for a length challenge. And so in this, we have the bridge must hover at least 1 inch above the build surface. So like above the ground or above the table, whatever you're building on. And you want the bridge as long as possible, but this can change. We're going to be tweaking criteria and constraints throughout and talking about some different substitutions for materials. And the bridge must measure at least 1 inch wide. And these are things that you can change, as I said. And then constraints are materials and time, but we're going to adjust. And gaps between the bridge planks, the part that you would walk upon. Let me just take this little banner off for a second so you can see. Those planks must be small enough that a penny laid flat could fit through the gaps. Now, that's if we're doing, a length. I like to make sure that they can't put these too far apart because it adds to the difficulty of making a very long bridge. But sometimes I do strength or capacity, and we're going to talk about the differences between them. And so in this case, you'll see this person didn't use planks. Now, what can we expect kids to have at home? And what do we expect parents to allow them to use? So I am a very frugal slash cheap person. I don't expect that parents are going to be keen on letting their kids use cotton swabs for a project necessarily. So they might not have that for them. They might not want them to use those even if they did. That's okay. They don't need to. I will tell you that if I were in my like a classroom that was mine, what I would probably do is I would buy one of these and I would divide them out so that each student gets an equal amount of them. Typically, even in a group, I only give them 20 to 30 of these anyway. So this should still work for an entire set of kids. But if they're at home, I'm not going to assume their parents are going to have these. And if they do have them, I'm not going to assume the parents are going to let them use it. So again, I would say to the students, we're going to be building a bridge. And in their teams, however these work out, you might have them all create a design based on the materials that they have. You might have them first meet in their team to talk about what materials they might be able to use. Go and do some collecting around the house to see what is available to you. You might have them decide one of them is going to design a bridge for length. One of them is going to design a bridge for strength, and one is going to do for capacity. And these designs might look markedly different based on what kind of bridge it is that they are building. I did take a look to see what do I have in my mailbox. So I found a piece of junk mail that was from a bank, and I cut up the outer envelope and rolled them up, and I used my address labels here. My thought was these are probably going to be the pillars or the base of my bridge. No matter what kind I'm building, this will work, right? And they're strong, so I don't have to have craft sticks. It's something that works. So you might, depending on the age of your students, have to work through with them. Usually we would use in this challenge, I wouldn't even tell them how, I wouldn't show them examples, but I would say usually we would use craft sticks. And what are some properties of craft sticks? And they might tell you the size, they might tell you that it's hard, that it's rigid, that it's strong. So one of the things that you can do either as a prelude to this challenge or as a standalone lesson, maybe when you're doing all those material substitutions, would be things like, what if we needed to make paper strong? If we needed it to be rigid, what are some treatments or what are some things you might do to make paper strong? And then have them create hopefully something, they'll come up with some idea and they can come back and present. I might do the same thing with a plastic bag. How do I make a plastic bag strong? I might do the reverse with very strong cardboard, like packing box kind of cardboard. How can I make that soft? What could I do to it to make it soft or flexible or pliable? And then get some ideas from them so that they're not going in blind necessarily. And if they go and they try and they get frustrated and they come back and they don't have anything, that's all right. Somebody in that class is going to, and we can work from there. And even if they don't, you can still like maybe have some little things on standby, right? Like you just put it off to the side in case you need it, in case, you come back and none of your kids have anything, then we can start talking about, well, what can we do to the paper? We could fold it. We could roll it. What else might we be able to do? And see what they come up with. But these would be my base. And then I could do something. I could cut this up into strips. I'm probably going to need, because usually I would have some kind of connection, right? I would have either pipe cleaners or I would have string. I don't expect my kids to have pipe cleaners at home and none of these materials, honestly, clothespins even. I might tell them, and I wouldn't show them like this. I know I keep saying that because I think it's important. But I would have maybe a picture of materials that I would usually use. And some of them would have been done in that base lesson of our usual, what other things can we substitute for string? We would already have that, right? So let's move on to measurement. They can come up with these ideas for materials in groups or together as a whole class. And I would just talk about like what is I do want to say this one thing with tape or with string, really focusing with the kids on what do we use those for? What is the function? So it's a connector or it's in a way to adhere one thing to another. So what else can we have? What else can we look for in our house that could manage that task? And we'll see some examples coming up in some of these other challenges too. All right. Length is sort of obvious, right? If we're measuring for length, we don't have a ruler or a tape measure, we can use anything we want. So whether it's just like, oh, I'm going to use my pointer finger and see how many there are, or I'm going to use the width of a soda can, or I am going to use toilet paper tubes and see how many there are. There are lots of ways to measure length without having a ruler, and have the kids come up with their own ideas, things that everybody would sort of understand the general size of, even if it's not perfect. Okay. The next thing is, okay, strength. What I would probably do in the classroom, if I were in the classroom, I like to have like little fall type things. So I might start with something kind of light and say like, oh, well, can your bridge sustain one piece of corn? Can it sustain two? And you as a teacher would be the one gently lifting and placing these on. Now, I know some of you are like, might not be able to do that because of the shared materials thing. You can use tongs if it's that you want to make sure you haven't touched anything that touches their design. We can be really specific about that and careful. You can use gloves. That's another option. One thing I didn't say before that kids might have on hand that they might want to use for planks, they might have toothpicks, but everything they need to understand that they need to ask permission from their parents if they're allowed to use the materials for these builds, because sometimes the materials are going to be reusable and sometimes not, right? If a kid's like building with toothpicks and you would usually use your toothpicks to actually in your mouth, I wouldn't want to do that, right? So it has to be something the parents are good with them using. What I would do next is after the corn, I'd have a small and medium and a large, right? In terms of like general weight. You could use books in your classroom too, by the way, for strength. And then I might use a small pumpkin, and then I might use a big pumpkin. Now, if your kids are younger, like maybe K1, 2, I doubt you're going to get anybody doing this well. Probably not. So instead, I might start my small version might be like those candy pumpkins, and then maybe a corn, and then maybe like a smallish pumpkin. But you can decide. There's lots of different options, right? By the way, I have to show you this. I don't even know what this is, but I saw this at the store the other day, and I was like, I need to have that. Looks like a UFO pumpkin. It made me very happy. I love fall decorations. All right, I'm gonna put that up there. Okay, I think that's all for that. Oh, one thing that you're going to want them to do is to help you understand, like, how are they going to measure the success of their designs, whether they're at home or in class? What do they think is a fair way to measure their designs, and have them debate that, because some kids are going to think some things are fair and some things are not. One thing we didn't talk about was capacity. Okay. Capacity and strength are related, but they're not exactly the same. So for capacity, it's how many of something the bridge can hold before collapsing. And you generally want it to be a uniform object. So if they're at home, maybe they have a lot of fast food packets that are pretty much the same. So they could use that. How many fast food packets can they fit on their bridge? They might have like those little green army men kind of things. They could use those. If you are in class, you might make baggies of like these things, or you can have the kids, if they have their own tongs, and as long as they're far enough apart, they could place them. This will be challenging, but might be some good fine motor skill practice. But there are different ways to do that. I mean, honestly, if I were doing this challenge this year in a pandemic, I'd probably focus on either the length or the strength, or a combination of both. It's a little bit easier than capacity, because capacity is usually, you saw in the video at the beginning, I usually use those candy pumpkins. And, it's a lot of touching and a lot of like, you just would need a lot of them if you're having every kid individually design their own bridge, which you kind of have to do. So I would avoid capacity most likely, but I like to give you options in case you don't want to avoid it. Okay, moving on. Is there anything else in this box? No. I'm going to move this box out of the way. I have a box for each challenge, so I can go through. my office is a total disaster right now. But that's okay. I don't mind a little chaos. All right, let me change this out because we are now on Creature Catcher. And Creature Catcher is up. So I'll move Skeleton out of the way. All right, Creature Catcher. So one thing I want to point out is that I'm careful to use the words creature catcher and not spider web because I don't necessarily want to lead them into creating a spider web. One of the things that's going to be really important for this challenge is they need to have their creatures, right? So one thing that they can do, I would like to show them. Oh my goodness. I don't think I have the right box. That's okay. We're going to be fine. Those little plastic spider rings are what I usually use. In a year like this, I would not do that because I wouldn't expect them to have it at home and I don't want parents going out to shop. I am not sure if I said this earlier on, so I'm going to say it now. When we do material substitutions, I would recommend requiring everybody to come up with 3 to 5 substitutions because we want the playing field to be flat. We don't want students whose parents are going to be the ones who go out to Dollar Tree and buy them the little spiders to not have to think through the problem. So even if they end up using the real plastic spiders at the end, that does not excuse them from the initial activity of coming up with substitutions. So what you would start with is showing them, hey, in a normal year, we would build a creature catcher. And the idea would be to build something that when we sprinkle creatures on top, it catches them. And I'm very careful not to use the word web, even though that's what a lot of kids will build. It's not what everybody builds. And if you don't use the word web, you're going to get more interesting designs. So, and then I would show them, here's what we would usually use. So then they start thinking about the properties. They're light. They usually have like little, legs coming out. So they would like catch on things. And so then I would ask the students, everybody, to go and find or to create some substitutions for creatures. And I have some different ideas that I think could work really well. One of them, I got to find this other box. I'm going to have to find this other box. I made all these ones earlier and then now I can't find them. I had a pipe cleaner and I had a bead. So I made a little creature. One thing I would tell them to do, this is almost like a mini challenge before the regular challenge, is a thing that's helpful for size requirements is to say that it must fit through a toilet paper tube. So if you can lay it flat and it doesn't fall through, you can decide as a teacher, are you okay with it going through that way? Because when you're sprinkling them, some of them will fall when they're sprinkling them. Some of them will fall that way, but not all of them. Or if you said like it has to fit in no matter whether it's flat or whatever, then if it's something that's foldable, they could just fold them and it'll work, right? If you're working on shapes, you could have the students do even just cut out of scrap paper. They could just cut out their own creatures, or you could say like you cut out some triangles, cut out some squares, cut out some circles, cut out some different shapes. I would probably only do that with like real little ones because I don't think it's very interesting for older kids. Another thing they could do is take the lids of water bottles. This is why I'm so upset because earlier today, guys, I drew little spiders on them with my Sharpie. Now they're gone. And I had some different ideas, but as we're going through the rest of the information today, I might find it as maybe it's in one of these other, maybe it's combined with one of these other ones. What else could they do? Oh, twisty ties. I found 2 twisty ties in my junk drawer and I just folded those up. I found some leaves outside, some little wood chips. So it doesn't have to look like the bug necessarily, but just something that's small enough that it would fit through a toilet paper tube roll. Because if they make them too big, it makes the creature catcher part of the challenge not very difficult and not very interesting. So what I would ask my students to do is make whatever 3 to 5. And then they would come back and they would present them in their small groups, or they would make flip grids, or they would show them in class. From there, I would have them decide which ones they like best, and then they need to make more of them. If you want to do math connections, and I usually do math connections afterward, I would ask them to do either like something that was in a multiple of 10 or in a multiple of 12, depending on what activities I might want to do afterwards, right? Multiples of 10 are easy to do percentages. not that 12s aren't necessarily, 12s are sort of very versatile, and that's why I tend to like those kind of groupings. I just realized I skipped something on Bone Bridge, but it's going to apply to this challenge as well. So I'm going to pull these out. You don't necessarily, whether if you wanted to do capacity for Bone Bridge, or in this case with Creature Catcher, we're trying to catch the most creatures, but we don't have to do it that way. And in a year when we're worried about materials acquisition, we might want to, instead of saying the most, instead set a base parameter for success. So if we were doing capacity for Bone Bridge, I might say you need a bridge that holds at least 12 eyeballs, if that's a thing you had at home, right? Or you need a bridge that holds at least 12 fast food packets, because that's what you had at home. With Creature Catcher, you need if you created 24 creatures, your Creature Catcher should catch at least half of them. Or you can make that however you want. You can do that by percentage or by fraction or just by base numbers. So you can say, oh, you're going to have 10 creatures, and your Creature Catcher should catch at least 6 of them. Whatever the number is, you can make it a base. This is another thing I would do multiple versions of, multiple iterations and multiple tests where they are tracking. So the first time I sprinkled, and then when I lifted it up, this many fell through. And then I did it again, this many fell through. It's another graphing possibility for you. In the past, the way that they build the actual catcher, oh, I should say this is another option. You can like even use like packing materials and stuff to just make like small little shapes. Again, they don't have to look like creatures or bugs. Maybe they have Play-Doh that they could use, and that's an option too. Whatever they have is fine. They just need to make things that are small, and they don't have to be the same. So, because not all bugs would be the same, right? So, and if we're thinking about it in our minds like a spider web, it's not only catching one kind of bug, right? So one thing that sometimes I have them do is build their Creature Catcher over some kind of container or bucket, so that when you're sprinkling it, it's already being held in place somehow. Now, in that case, the kids are going to need something that connects it. In the past, I've used binder clips, tape, pipe cleaners that wrap around. Easier to do if they're in class than at home. But at home, maybe they have their own ideas. If they don't have an option like this, they can do it just like you saw in the video at the very beginning. You put the Creature Catcher on a flat surface, you sprinkle the creatures on top, and then you lift it up. Now, in that case, you would need to have something in your criteria and constraints list. I realized I forgot to show you that. That defines that it needs to be able, you need to be able to pick it up by yourself. So it's going to need to be stable on those 4 corners enough for you to pick it up. That's going to be tricky for some kids. We'll say also on this one, I typically, when you could work with another partner on these challenges, I would use a lot of string. And I think that can still work for probably 4th grade and 5th grade and up, maybe 3rd, but expecting like K to 2 or maybe even 3 to tie their own knots, that can take a long time, and that can be really tricky and frustrating for them. So that might not be a battle you want to fight. So in that case, I would work more with trying to get them to do strips of things. I don't think necessarily it'll be any easier for them to braid something like this, but maybe they can cut strips of pliable cardboard like cereal boxes. Maybe we could encourage them to use a weaving technique. And you can see on the criterion constraints list here, in a typical year, I would have the build surface be a 12 by 12 inch, but they aren't necessarily going to be able to measure 12 inches by 12 inches. So again, we can use something customary, like, you're going to want to build, like, put a marker down. So if you take this and you put it down on the table, put something in its place to stand by the corners, and then you make like the square that way. You can try doing that. You can tell them, look at the size of your Chromebook or your iPad or a scratch piece of paper or your cereal box. That's another thing you can do if you wanted to. Have them take a cereal box and then cut part of it off, or ask their parents to if they're littles, and they can build over this. That could work as well. Or a placemat. lots of different options. So just like if the kid is having, like, ask your students, like, get that feedback from them. If you're having trouble figuring out what size to build over or whatever, bring it to class, ask this question, put it on Padlet, use it on a, shared Google slide that we can talk about it before we get too far along and you don't want them to get so frustrated, right? All right, let me look along here and see where I'm at. Okay, I think I am just so upset with myself, guys, that I made all these bugs earlier and I don't know where they are. Where on earth could they be? I want to see if they're in with the ghosts. I don't think they are. Okay, that's fine. We're not going to worry about it, guys. I'll see if I think of any of the other ones that I made. I'll tell you. I think I remembered most of them. Okay. Now, we're going to move on to treat toss. So I want to move that. I want to move my little pumpkin here. The reason I'm using a pumpkin is because I don't have a little piece of candy to symbolize treat toss, but I usually use those, what I call those gross little pumpkin candies, because who wants to eat those? Sorry if I've insulted you, but I am not a fan. All right, so treat toss is a little challenge that I actually made. Actually, I made all of these in 2015. It's been a while, but this one is sort of weird to me because it feels very of the time now. So I wanted the students to design something for Mr. Jones, who has the flu. And in order not to spread his germs to trick-or-treaters, he needs a device to launch candy from his door to trick-or-treaters on the sidewalk. And then you're going to design and build a treat toss device with the following criteria and constraints. I'm realizing as I'm looking at this, because you can see behind it, there's another criteria and constraints list. And that's just using designs that aren't Halloween themed so that you could do this if you weren't doing Halloween. I realized with Creature Catcher, I didn't say anything about that. And Bone Bridge, I'm doing a bad job. With Bone Bridge, I connect that by just going into vertebrates versus invertebrates, or skeletal system if you've got upper grades kids. So it doesn't have to have anything to do with Halloween if you don't want it to. With this challenge, I simply use just candy, and we don't really talk about trick-or-treaters. And the criteria and constraints list I use wouldn't talk about Mr. Jones and having the flu. It's just we need a low energy machine that's going to get candy from one place to the next without touching. Okay. And I just don't have the story behind it, that it's like someone has germs and doesn't want to share that, doesn't want to spread them, but you could relate it to COVID, obviously, if you wanted to. So I am going to get into what changes we need to make. Okay, one thing first. I don't say that I want necessarily a catapult. You can get catapults, certainly, depending on what they build. But if you are careful not to say catapult, then you might get some different kinds of designs. This is another one. It's very, very important because we are launching candy, or we're going to launch a small soft object, whether it's candy or not. You're going to definitely need parents on board, and you're going to definitely need to be careful with what you say to your students about testing, because you don't want them to hurt themselves or anybody else or any objects, right? Because some will think to make sort of a slingshot kind of design. That might be okay, depending on the parent. It might not be. Your students might make something that's like this, which actually doesn't have the last piece that it needs on it, because there wouldn't be a way. This can, depending on what your object is that you're launching, it might hold it in place when you move this down. It might not. So let's start talking about some materials differences. One thing you might want to do is actually make this 2 challenges. Do one or do both. So one thing is, if we don't ever want to touch the candy because we don't want to infect with the germs, right? Then the person can't even pick up the candy to move it onto whatever their launcher is, right? So you can decide, do you let the kids have some tongs? Do you ask them to create their own version of pinchers or tongs so that there's never any contact with the candy? Or do you simply say, we're going to use gloves, or we would pretend we're using gloves? That's an option so that we know we're not sharing those germs that way. That can be your first base, right? Because we want to stay in the storyline of you're not touching it. So it would need to be something like, I pick up the candy, I place it in here, and then from there I can launch it without actually touching it ever. And then all they need really is somewhere in the distance, they need to have a target, and their target can really be anything. In the old times, I would print up a little picture of a trick or treater, or they could just put a pumpkin somewhere. They could put anything. They could put their shoe down somewhere and see how close can they get to the shoe if we're looking for accuracy. Or we can go for maximum distance, and then we do the same thing we did with Wings Wanted, where we just do heel to toe to count off. So you can build your candy launcher for accuracy or for maximum distance, or you can try to do some kind of combination of the two. You might just say like, hey, we know we need to keep at least 6 feet apart. So your candy launcher needs to go at least 6 feet, and it should land within, maybe that's just it. It just needs to go at least 6 feet. Done. Or it needs to go within at least 6 feet away from you, and it should land within, I don't know, a foot, like literal, like their foot from the target. Okay. Let me see if there's anything else on treat toss I wanted to say. Make sure parent supervision and parents are okay with anything. One thing I wanted to say in general with any of these challenges, when you're creating your criterion constraints list, your kids might be able to work around it. They might find a loophole. That could definitely happen with Creature Catcher, right? Because depending on how you write up your criteria and constraints list, you might end up having it so that what they end up building isn't really like a web or doesn't really have holes in it. If they have too many materials, it could be like basically like, oh, I'm sprinkling all my creatures on top of a full piece of paper. And so of course it's going to catch everything. There's no gaps for it to fall through. So this can happen even when you've made your best attempts to create a criterion constraints list. A student might find a loophole that goes against the spirit of the challenge. Don't get upset if that happens. Like, that's actually a good thing. But what you want to do is congratulate them for being clever and finding the loophole, and then involve your class and saying, now, how do we close that loophole? Because I think we all know that's not really what the spirit of the challenge was. And then we can figure out, because maybe what you need to do is have more of a constraint about the amount or the types of materials you use. One thing, I know I'm going back to Creature Catcher for a minute, and I apologize. One thing you can do is that, each strip of whatever you're using can't be wider than your pinky. And then maybe you get, 12 strips of whatever it is you made, or 20 strips of whatever it is you made. Okay. Sorry. I don't know how I missed that. I didn't, because I wasn't careful to go back and just make sure that I had everything covered, and I do now. Okay. Moving right along. It's time for Ghosts in the Graveyard. Let me find that box. Where's my Ghosts in the Graveyard? And if you don't, as I was saying, some of you can't do Halloween, or you just don't want to, it is not for you. That's all right. We're not going to worry about that, because we can also do something like Grapes in the Vineyard. Okay. Which box is my ghost box? Well, I put these on top. Okay. Here we go. Back in frame. Almost there. We're in the home stretch, guys. Ghosts in the Graveyard is a pulley challenge. It's a simple machines challenge. Now, in a normal year, if you have littles, I would usually give them a small paper plate, and I would give them some string. And sometimes I would even allow them to, sorry, I'd take this banner off so you can see this. Sometimes I would even give them the binder clip. It's probably not going to work at home. With older kids, I would never give them a full paper plate. And this is like the small dessert size. I would cut these in half, and they would only get half of one, because it makes that a lot more difficult to do. Sometimes I don't even give them anything rigid like that at all. Maybe they're working with plastic bags. Maybe they're working with pieces of paper, but you're going to have some of the same challenges that you might have with Creature Catcher and working with these different materials. So, but usually what we use would be things like string, paper plates. Maybe they have some pipe cleaners. And then I go through and put little ghost faces on cotton balls. That's not going to be a thing that we do this year, right? So let's talk about, I forgot to put my little indicator up here, my little ghost decoration. All right, so let's take a look at the basic criteria and constraints list for this. Create a ghost transporter device to lift as many ghosts as possible from the graveyard to the top of the pulley using the following criteria and constraints. You want to transport the maximum number of ghosts from the graveyard to the top of the lift, and the device must attach the pulley to the pulley using the binder clip. And constraints start with just materials and time. And again, in my resources, I give you some other ideas to make it harder, ways you can adjust materials as well. We're going to talk about some basics of assuming kids don't have these materials at home, or you have to supply for everybody in your class and you want to keep it super cheap. Ooh, which I can definitely identify with. Okay. Everything's falling down around me, but that's okay. It's kind of a par for the course this year, isn't it? Okay. So, and then Grapes in the Vineyard is just a different version I use in case we're not doing Halloween. But it keeps sort of the spirit of the cotton ball because it's round. And one of the things we do is we're lifting the pulley up with older students, especially, is we want to create some wind in the environment, which you can ask students to do with a hair dryer or a fan, or if they don't have those things at home, even just going outside with parental permission. I'm going to take this little picture off. Let me put Ghost in the Graveyard back on the screen. And we take this off so you can see more as we're going through. Okay. One thing that you can do is ask the students to look at the cotton ball, as I said earlier on with the materials, and then create some different ideas, or go look around their house for some different ideas that could substitute for the ghost, and then have them bring these back. For me, this one and Creature Catcher are the most rich challenges in terms of looking for material substitutions. I think the kids would really enjoy either creating or finding substitutions for the creatures. And the same thing is true for the ghosts, if you can use ghosts and get away with that in your classroom. So they might come back with, they might be looking at the fact that the cotton balls are pretty much round. So they might come back with things like these playground balls, but this is pretty heavy. I don't think you'd lose many of them to the wind, but that's a discussion you would have with your kids. They might have these little like pom-pom balls, for arts and crafts. If their mom or they or their dad or whoever in their family enjoy crafting, they might just have these on hand. And those would be things they might be allowed to use in this way for these kind of challenges. We also need to think about the pulley system itself. And these are not my only ghosts. Oh, I found some on the ground. I drop things as we go. I get too excited. Both for the actual main material for the transporter, I'm not expecting that they're going to necessarily have paper plates, or that they might not want to use them for this purpose. So again, with everything scratch paper, with everything cereal boxes or food packaging. And I do think that coffee filters might be an option, but they'd have to ask their parents. If they're in class, this is one of the things I would use, both as an option for the ghosts and potentially for their actual transporter as well. And they could actually, just like cut these up, or, maybe pinch them off and use a piece of string, and now they have some ghosts. You could decide size-wise on these. If you're in class, maybe they can measure with the ruler, and maybe you decide they shouldn't be, longer than whatever, 2 inches or 3 inches, and they shouldn't be wider than 2 or 3 inches. You could do the same thing. It needs to fit through the width of the toilet paper roll. And then I think these are my only other two options. Oh, I know one of the things I did for creatures earlier, guys, that I wanted to share with you. I'll come back to it. So the pulley system. Now that is maybe going to be a little bit tricky, right? Usually what I use is a broom handle, and I put it basically balance it between two chairs. They might not have that at home, but if they wanted to, and then I use a big long rope. Maybe they have a jump rope they could use if they had that system sort of available to them. Maybe they don't. So if they don't have something that's that big that they could use, then instead you could have them use, paper towel. I forgot the word, paper towel roll. And then they could create maybe their own ropes or use shoelaces in order to connect. And you don't have to have a binder clip. They could just actually tie it, since they're only, one of the reasons we usually use a binder clip, and I usually allow them, I just hand them the binder clip, and then I use usually a carabiner with mine. with the main connection on the broom handle, because I'm usually testing with many, many groups. And I want it to be a quick transition of take the binder clip off the carabiner, give it to them, put the next one on and test it. Because we usually only have 1 or 2 setups, right, for the testing. But if they're at home and they're doing their own, there's no reason they couldn't actually just tie, instead of using a binder clip, their transporter to the main rope. And then you don't have to have it so high off the ground, really. You could just have basically 2 paper towel holders. You could even show them that setup if you wanted to, but with older students, I would make that probably part of the challenge. If they've already done Apple Annihilator, they may have already built something sort of similar where they have a structure that has a main bar over it. And that bar might be another toilet paper tube. It might be a pencil. There could be lots of different options. Again, I usually try to define what the thing, whatever the thing they're building, what the point of it is, or what the function of it is, so that I might get different results. Other ways you can make ghosts. This is just another plastic bag, and it's an address label that I use to like sort of tie off to give them a little head. You might have just general packaging from food, or those what's it called? Packing peanuts would work well for this as well. Ping pong balls. Okay. The other thing I wanted to tell you might be an option for creatures is cutting little pieces off of the straws, and maybe even going in and then folding, like cutting in through the center and like folding these pieces up so they're more likely to catch on the creature catcher. That makes sense. Okay, I think I'm all the way through everything. The only other thing I wanted to check was if there was anything else on the clipboard, which has also disappeared somehow. It must have fallen. That's okay. I think I got everything for Ghost in the Graveyard. What was I going to say for measurement? Oh, for measurement, it's pretty much the same as whatever you would do for Creature Catcher would work for Ghost in the Graveyard. So whether it's a base of, they're going to make 20 ghosts or 25 ghosts or whatever it is, and they need to be able to lift from the floor to wherever the top of the pulley is. And they should only they have to get at least 20 of them up without losing them to wind or from, the wild swinging of their pulleys. That's what I would do. So all along the way, I've been looking. I did notice that Jamie wrote that she loves Flipgrid for sharing STEM creations. I think it's such a fabulous tool. I've heard lots of great things from people about using that with their kids. I think Google Slides is a really good tool as well. Kids can take pictures as they're going through their process of the different steps so that others can give them feedback, or others can try to build the same creations. We have a lot of options available to us, and there are lots of ways we can still do these STEM challenges, even though we can't share materials necessarily. And even though kids may be at home, and we don't want to stress parents my goal always is, we're going to find substitutions for everything that we need to find substitutions for. Nobody should have to buy anything. I don't want people feeling like they need to go out to the store. Resources are scarce. And that's why I've tried really hard in the past, I've tended to use food items. And I still, depending on what it is, I might still do that. But I tried not to use any today. But I do think, for me, I have, dried noodles, like those rotini noodles. I use those in several different challenges, and I feel okay about that because it's the same set. It's the same bag of rotini noodles. I use it year after year after year. But in a parent's home, I don't feel comfortable asking them to use a food material because it's just too scarce right now. But some materials, maybe like beans, they have hard, not canned, but the hard beans. Depending on what the challenge is, you might be able to use that and still reuse it, right? Because they've got to soak it and they've got to cook it, and it's probably fine if the kids wash their hands. And it's your family, right? That could be okay. So I'm trying to be really careful about that. And as we go throughout the seasons here, I will continue to do some pandemic makeovers as we need to do them. Again, remember, if you want more information about any of these challenges, you can find them down below on any of those sites. And make sure that you are following, you either get emails from me, you're signed up for that, and or you check in with me on Facebook or Instagram at Feel Good Teaching on Sunday and Monday. Make sure you pay attention because one of these challenges I'm giving, I'm going to tell you how you can get it for free, the print and the paperless version. So if you're hybrid, you're totally covered. Or if you're one or the other, you're still covered too. Okay, that's everything for now. If you are watching this after the fact or you come up with a question or a thought later, it doesn't even have to be a question. If you have an idea for something, to add to this, please feel free. Put it in the comments. And if it's a question, I should get the notification. And if you ask and you don't see something from me within a day, you can come back and tag me. Or just tag me in the original. And I'm happy to come back and talk more about it or give you some more ideas. If there's something I said that you're just like, you're way off, Carrie, that's never going to work. I'm open. Tell me what's wrong. I'm happy to try to come up with workarounds. I really like the problem solving of this. And then the number one thing before I go, whatever you're doing this year, when you run into a problem, don't feel like you have to fix that problem yourself. If it's a real world problem, take it to your students. If there's a problem of, I really want to do this STEM challenge, but here's how it's usually done. And here are our new constraints with social distancing, or, we have to sanitize the materials if we're going to use whatever it is, whatever your constraints are, bring them in and have them brainstorm. What can we do to change the challenge so that we can do it? You have a lot going on. Don't feel like you need to solve all the problems, and don't hog all the problems, that's the thing kids are going to have a lot of buy-in for, right? It's something that's real, that's relevant, that's authentic. It's a problem that they need to help you solve, and they're going to be into it. So let them help you solve it, whether it's something that has to change about the way you measure the challenge or conduct the challenge or access the materials. Have them help you figure it out. It's going to be a great life skill for them. There's lots of stuff I have to figure out all the time to make substitutions for. So let them help. All right. Have a wonderful weekend. I know we're not quite there yet, but we're close enough. Have a great weekend. I'll talk to you soon.